She did, in fact. She used a lot of sources. Research has shown over the years that she read extensively in Protestant religious authors of her day and used that in her writings. She derived insights and language from these other writers. This goes all the way back to the plagiarism charge by Walter Ray in the early 1980s, and he looked at her writings and compared them with other writings, and his conclusion was, well, she plagiarized. She stole from those other authors. Well, that really got the church alert to that issue, and since that time, there's been just tons of research looking at these original sources that she used and her writings and how she used them. And the research has shown that she engaged in literary borrowing, legitimate literary borrowing, not plagiarism. And she had a library of about 1,300 volumes. So she read quite a bit in other writings. But the key is how inspiration operated in her experience. She already had the images and ideas in mind. And did she get ideas from these other authors? No, she already had her visions and images in mind. Concepts inspired truth in her mind. And she read these other writings to help her express what she'd seen in vision. Again, the backdrop for that is how inspiration worked. God doesn't supernaturally endow a prophet with something they don't have. He used what abilities and language she had at the time. And when she first began receiving her visions in the early 1840s, she didn't have a strong educational background and she lacked powers of expression. And early on, she was told, and this is what her son Willie would say later, that the Lord told her, you will find gems of truth and insight in the writings of others. So she received these visions and she felt a craving to express what she had seen in the best language possible. And she lacked a wide vocabulary. And she felt that need. You will hear her lament that if only I was a scholar. And the term scholar for her meant someone who was learned and had read a lot. And so she began to search out these volumes and read what other writers said. And she called those gems of truth that had to be rescued from the context of rubbish, but perfect gems and pulled out of their context. And so she read to improve her powers of expression, to gather from other authors ways of expressing things that she had seen in vision. That's why she read so many books on the life of Christ. She had seen Jesus' life in vision. Scenes, she called it. She uses the term scenes a lot in her writings in describing the life of Christ. And so she looked for the way other authors wrote on the life of Christ and described scenes that she had seen in vision. And she borrowed fragments of expression and language from these other authors. But the end product was uniquely hers. It had her unique signature on it. While she drew from about 50 other books in writing the life of Christ, the end product had Ellen White's unique signature on it. And it expressed her worldview of the great controversy between Christ and Satan, which no other author of that day expressed anything close to that. So she used other writings to enhance her powers of expression. And that's how inspiration worked. And over the years, Ellen White grew in her ability to express herself. And then she would read other authors and she would come across a gem of truth. And this is something that I will point out in my chapter because I have a column of the original source she drew from and how she took a great thought and improved it, enhanced it. So from all of her reading over the years, her powers of expression, her vocabulary grew significantly. And so the latter decades of her life, when she wrote the famous Conflict of the Age series, that's when her powers of expression were at their best. But she still read other books to get insights and to stimulate her memory on what she had seen in vision. So the bottom line is her reading helped her express what she had seen in vision with greater clarity and power. I think it's very important for us to know that Ellen White used extra biblical sources because, number one, critics are capitalizing on that. And the plagiarism charge that was really popularized with Walter Ray in the early 1980s. Actually, he was reviving something that had been around at the turn of the century. D.M. Canwright first charged Ellen White of plagiarism. And then it died off, and then Walter Ray revived it again. And it's been alive pretty much since then. And today, it is the most popular charge against Ellen White. So as Adventists, we need to understand that to be able to respond to it. How do you respond to the charge? Well, Ellen White copied from other authors and plagiarized this. You see here, sees one column of the sources, and here's another column. It's clearly recognizable that she was drawing from this source. You see how she was copying? And how do we respond to that? Well, that's why we need to study it and understand the distinction between plagiarism and legitimate literary borrowing, which Ellen White engaged in. We also need to understand how copyrights and the plagiarism issue, how it functioned in the 19th century. The laws then were quite different than they are today. So understanding those issues really helps us respond effectively to the plagiarism charge. And as we look at sources Ellen White used and how she used those sources, it's abundantly clear that she was borrowing and actually changing and enhancing that material. And when you look at a source in its context and then look at how Ellen White used it, she completely changed it, and her thought goes in a completely different direction than the source. Some have said, well, why don't we footnote Desire of Ages? And I've thought about that a lot. And I think Ellen White would object to that, because if we put a footnote to everything where she used another author, sometimes it's just a few words, and it would be an incidental footnote that really isn't worth much. And today, I know when I footnote, I put a source as an authority. I want people to go and read that. Well, she would look at that and say, well, you know, you've footnoted this right here, but if you go and read that source, I don't agree with him. I just drew some of the language, but I disagree with the thought in the whole page. So understanding that helps us know how inspiration worked in her experience. And I think the bottom line of how helpful this is to Adventists today is understanding how inspiration worked. And it has driven the church to a more comprehensive, whole-person view of inspiration, away from the more rigid, word-oriented, dictational type of inspiration that has a history in our church. And so when you see how Ellen White used these literary sources, as well as how the Bible writers used sources of their day, which a number of the presentations in the chapters in the book deal with how biblical writers drew from other sources, it really enhances your appreciation of how God worked in the biblical prophets and in the experience of Ellen G. White.